Walter Brueggemann passed away recently, and I posted a quick video here on the channel giving a bit of a tribute, pointing people to some of his work. But I also had an opportunity to talk to our community about some of the core themes across his writing. And so if you're interested in a very quick primer on the biography, core themes of Brueggemann's work, this might be for you.
But as a pastor's son, Brueggemann found himself shaped by the life of a small rural church. And so after his initial BA, he turned his attention to theology, completing a Bachelor of Theology, then a Doctorate of Theology, and then finally a PhD in education. And I think it was really that combination of a theologian's mind and an educator's heart that made his voice so unique. His writing was deep and researched and footnoted to the heavens, and yet also widely accessible and actually just pretty engaging to read. I've done a lot of writing in my life. I've done academic writing. I've written books. I write sermons pretty regularly, of course. But finding the way to weave together everything you learn in those disparate disciplines, that's a very rare skill, and one that Brueggemann did incredibly well. One of the things I've always admired about his writing was that you would learn something and actually enjoy getting there. And I think that's reflected in the fact that the dude published more than 100 books in his career, and that was all before AI was even a thing. That blows my mind, especially considering the fact that he was also teaching at Columbia Theological Seminary across 3 decades in his life. Now, Brueggemann was primarily an Old Testament scholar, but there are some very important themes from across his writing that I think define his contributions and probably will help us to get our feet under us when we turn our attention back to the scriptures today. And the first was that lament is an act of faith, especially in a world where we don't like to be, where we probably even actively try to avoid being sad. Brueggemann reminded us that the powers that be, the empires around us, whoever holds power now, wants us to remain numb. That's because he thought that if we could learn to lament, if we could practice naming what was wrong, then in that we could also acknowledge what could be better, and maybe we could begin to imagine what might be different. So think about that next time you are sad. Your grief is an acknowledgement of what could be. It is the first step in moving beyond what is toward that. Second, Brueggemann had this conviction that God was interested in creating what he called an alternative community. So not church for the sake of more church, that's boring, but maybe church for the sake of demonstrating a new way to live together. And that might mean resisting consumerism, or pushing back on individualism, rejecting all of these fear-based systems around us. But really, it was about allowing church, everything we do together, to become a microcosm of what's possible in the world. So we evangelize, or we good news our neighborhoods, not with placards and soapboxes and threats of hell, but actually by coming together across lines that feel entrenched, whether that's socioeconomic or political or ethnic and cultural. But we come together to care for each other, to learn from each other, to find common purpose, and ultimately to accomplish things together that none of us could do on our own. And specifically for Brueggemann, those things we can't get done on our own, that was largely about justice for the poor. See, I mentioned this already, but Brueggemann was primarily an Old Testament scholar, and one of the key features of his work was taking those ethical frameworks of ancient Israel and at least trying to apply them to contemporary society. All those verses about caring for orphans and widows and the stranger. All of those rules about debt forgiveness and jubilee. Those guidelines about leaving enough on the table for those who need it. His question was, how can we get serious about that together? Because, as a final theme, Brueggemann articulated what he called the prophetic imagination. And that had nothing to do with predicting the future. It was all about this insistence that the Bible is all of it poetry. You see, propositions get necessarily fixed in a time and place. But for the Bible to be alive and active today, for us to really make sense of the words that were spoken on behalf of God, what we need is actually to learn to read more creatively. Said another way, read as prose, the Bible can tell us about things that happened. But read as poetry or a story, the Bible can begin to speak to us about what is happening all around us all the time. And so as a very small example here, Brueggemann wrote a lot about Sabbath in his career, that practice of resting weekly. But he saw that not primarily as a rule to be followed or a law to be enacted, but as a conscious act of resistance. He saw the practice of rest as a chosen confrontation with the perpetual narrative that human beings are worth what we produce. And so as a scholar, you can read Sabbath as a set of arcane laws from an ancient desert people based on their creation mythologies. But as a poet, Brueggemann argued you can read Sabbath as a reminder that human beings need to consciously, consistently push back against the idea that we are what we contribute to the economies around us. We're more than that. And that's the kind of prophetic imagination, the creativity that's woven all throughout the Bible, if we slow down long enough to notice.